Welcome to ILTV's Insider Program. I'm your host, Calev Ben-David. A sudden invitation to the White House for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from President Donald Trump was likely to produce some headlines. And Monday's meeting at the Oval Office did not disappoint. Now, the big news was Trump's surprise announcement of new direct talks between the U.S. and Iran over its nuclear program starting this Saturday in the Gulf state of Oman. The two leaders also discussing a proposal for a new deal to free more hostages from Gaza, Turkey's growing influence in Syria, and the new U.S. tariffs on Israeli exports. There's lots to break down, and with us to do so are Nadav Tamir, he's the former Consul General of Israel to New England and Boston, and J Street Israel's Executive Director. Also with us is Reserves IDF Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch, Director of the Initiative for Palestinian Authority Accountability and Reform in the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs, and the former Director of the Military Prosecution for Judea and Samaria. And gentlemen, let's start with the Iran talks. Here's what President Trump had to say on that.
We're having direct talks with Iran, and they've started. It'll go on Saturday. We have a very big meeting, and we'll see what can happen. And I think everybody agrees that doing a deal would be preferable to doing the obvious. And the obvious is not something that I want to be involved with, or frankly, that Israel wants to be involved with if they can avoid it. So we're going to see if we can avoid it. But it's getting to be very dangerous territory. And hopefully those talks will be successful. And I think it would be in Iran's best interest if they are successful. We hope that's going to happen.
Nadav, I don't know how much of a surprise that was to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Certainly was a surprise to the rest of us. Once the shock wears off, though, how should Israel be thinking about these new talks with Iran?
Well, you know, I cannot speak for the Israeli government because I have completely different views about. I think that Trump is right to go for diplomacy. I think that the fantasies that Israel could dismantle the Iran nuclear project with some American help, or even that America could do it just by a surgical attack, is not in the cards because they already have the uranium. And so diplomacy is the best way to do it. And I hope that this time around, unlike with the JCPOA, Israel will be a team player and will help the Americans with intelligence and will not try to undermine the negotiations.
Maurice, your response, it could be to Nadav's points, and I wonder if there are some aspects that maybe about these talks that concern you.
So I have to say, I don't think that the idea of talks necessarily came as a surprise to Prime Minister Netanyahu. We saw already last week in the French Parliament a discussion that was held head by Macron on the Iran situation. Thereafter, the French Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, came out and said, if the talks do not succeed, then military operations are inevitable. We also saw into that the response of President Trump's nominee as the chief of staff for the U.S. forces, saying that also on the Iran scale, military operations may not be sufficient in and of themselves, and there might be a requirement for some type of engagement. So I don't think it's a surprise. I think that President Trump is going into this nonetheless eyes wide open. He understood that the JCPOA was a disaster, that Iran would breach that agreement as they did all the way through, that it failed to address the ballistic missiles issue, which we've seen the fruits of that just in the last year. And I think that this time going in, Iran will be placed on behind a rock and a hard place to agree to substantial waivers in their program, possibly even some transparency, and if not, fear the course of the military attack. That's, I think, something that President Trump has said all the way along, and that's something which is now on the cards. I believe that anyone who thinks that you can negotiate honestly with the Iranians and come out with a deal that they will respect is deluding themselves.
President Trump clearly does believe that, or why would he be going into these talks?
I think he's trying to really make sure that all of the avenues have been explored and exhausted before resorting to military force. And this is part of that process. I don't think it's something which he is necessarily going to say, well, whatever the Iranians sell us, as they did to Obama in 2015, we're going to take. And I think his approach will probably be much more hardcore.
Well, clearly you feel differently, Nadav.
Absolutely.
But I do also want to ask you that even if Iran would honor its commitments on its nuclear program, one of the criticisms of the first deal was that it didn't address some other issues that Israel is concerned about: the ballistic missile program of Iran, its support for terror groups like Hezbollah or the Houthis currently going on. So the question is about whether even if the parameters of the deal would be acceptable, even if it would restrain Iran's nuclear program.
Well, first of all, I completely disagree. The Iranian did deliver what they were supposed to do during the JCPOA, according to all intelligence agencies. And Iran became a nuclear threshold state because Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. Not only that, that enabled Russia and China to be in complete symbiosis with Iran, which makes any American sanctions so much more weaker when it's not international. I do think, of course, that it would be amazing if you could have an agreement with Iran about everything. I don't know if it was in the cards then. I don't know if it's in the cards now. I think that definitely preventing Iran from a nuclear option is the priority. If we could get them also not to have ballistic missiles and to give up their proxies, that will be great. I think that when Obama decided to go for it, it was because it was the best alternative available. And this is what most of the security people at the time in Israel say today in retrospective.
Right. You could respond more. So do you have any concerns, though, that Trump might go for a deal that would be tougher than the Obama deal, but still fall short of what Israel wants? Are you concerned that someone like, for example, Steve Witkoff will be the lead negotiator in Amman initially, and not someone like, for example, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's on record as being more hawkish or at least more skeptical of Iran's intentions?
I think we have to understand what drives America and what drives President Trump. In the elections last year, the number one subject for all of the voters was the economy. And that is really the first concern of President Trump. A strike in Iran, as beneficial as it would be to world peace, is not necessarily in the best interests of the U.S. economy.
Sure, oil prices could be an issue.
Exactly. Iran had been breaching the agreement, breaching the sanctions, sending its dark fleet to provide much of the demand of China for oil. And a strike on Iran would leave China with that demand, but without its source of oil. And that added demand would then drive up oil prices, not necessarily in America's best interest, at least in the short term economically. In the long term, obviously, destroying Iran, destroying that axis of evil, providing the ability to create a passage and a corridor from the Arabian Gulf through to the Mediterranean, as has been discussed via Saudi Arabia as part of the normalization deal. This could be really the vision for the new Middle East that President Trump is certainly much more, I think, committed to and much more involved in. I fail to understand exactly what Nadav said before. He said, on the one hand, Iran had met all of its commitments under the JCPOA. But on the other hand, he said, well, Iran became a nuclear threshold country because Trump pulled out. So which is the right answer?
Because when there's no
Trump
agreement,
didn't need to be there
Iran
in the
could
first
do whatever
place,
they want.
and Iran was going to respect the agreement, then that's well and good. You can't hold that stick from both sides.
No. I mean,
and really, the breach of the agreement was the Iranian activities to push forward,
because
and
Trump
that was it.
withdrew
And
from the
anyone who
agreement.
says otherwise is just
the
wrong.
Iranians felt free to do what they want.
Okay, gentlemen, let's not relitigate that, and we can spend the rest of the program. I do want to move on because there are other important issues that were discussed there, especially the potential for another hostage deal and the situation in the Gaza Strip. Let's hear what President Trump had to say on that subject.
We are trying very hard to get the hostages out. We're looking at another ceasefire. We'll see what happens. But we want to get the hostages out. The Israeli people want the hostages out more than anything. They want the hostages out. This man is working very hard with us to do that. I mean, I don't know. I hope he's being appreciated because he's been a great leader. He's working very, very hard on the hostages and many other things.
Nadav, there is a new so-called compromise proposal being supposedly offered by the Egyptian mediators for the release of 8 living hostages and 8 bodies from Gaza. There was some people thought there might be the announcement, at least from Trump's side, of a new hostage deal or his desire. Your reaction? Were you disappointed that there wasn't?
Well, first of all, yeah, every day that those hostages are still there is very disappointing, because I think that the deal was it was a possibility if Israel would agree to the one demand. And I'm not saying it as an advocate for Hamas. Hamas is a brutal terror organization. But if we want the hostages back, the only way to get all of them is to end the war in Gaza, which is also the only way to get an alternative for Hamas in Gaza. So I think that if there will be a partial deal, you know, I will still be happy that some of them will come back, but that does not solve the whole issue of hostages and does not stop this war that is purposeless for many months right now. And we're risking soldiers and hostages, and we're creating a huge humanitarian
I'm
catastrophe
asking you about
in Gaza.
the U.S., how you feel about President Trump's, his comments on the...
I think that, unfortunately, the Bibi team was able to sell him this fantasy that somehow this military pressure will get Hamas to surrender. It's not in the cards. It's not going to happen. I do hope that somewhere, you know, before he goes to Saudi Arabia, he will understand that if he wants things to move forward with the normalization, with ending the war, he will have to say to Netanyahu, you have to choose between me and the Saudis or Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And unless he does it, there will be no deal.
Again, your reaction was, I agree with Nadav that it does seem that President Trump was giving some, let's say, if you want to call it breathing room and maneuverability to Prime Minister Netanyahu to continue the military efforts in Gaza, though the president did seem to retreat back from the Gaza plan that he had earlier spoken about, relocating the residents there. Your response?
So I think, or I fear, that Prime Minister Netanyahu was able to influence President Trump to really detract from his basic, moral, correct, and just demand the immediate release of all of the hostages, and if not, all hell should break loose in Gaza. That's what he said a month and a half ago. That's what he said over and over
His
again.
His tone was different in this meeting.
And now it appears that Prime Minister Netanyahu has persuaded him possibly to reverse that and to agree to another piecemeal deal with these barbarians. That is something which should be rejected by the Israeli public over and over again. As every side of the camp says, I think this is possibly one of the few issues that Nadav and I could possibly agree on. We demand the release of the immediate release of all of the hostages unconditionally now. Right. Not waiting, not piecemeal, not 8 bodies, not 8 live ones. All of them right now. And I'm sure that Nadav would want that as well. And every side of Israel's society is really united in that call. And I hope that Prime Minister Netanyahu wasn't able to persuade President Trump that he should relinquish that just demand.
Well, I think Nadav said he would be willing to accept a partial if that was the only option. But I do want to ask you, you mentioned that announced trip to Saudi Arabia next month by President Trump. He mentioned Saudi Arabia, Qatar. He did not mention coming to Israel. Was that a message of some kind, you think?
Listen, I think that what Trump really wants in the Middle East is the glory of a deal maker and a Nobel Peace Prize and business. Business comes from the Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from the Emirates. It doesn't come from Israel. This is his priority. I think that in some ways it could be helpful, even for someone like me, who doesn't have anything to do with the Trump values, because I think the Saudi deal is the only way to really stop the war and bring a political horizon for the Palestinians, which I believe is the most existential Israeli interest.
And your feeling about the role of the Saudis and Qatar, especially, we don't have to get into the current political debate in Israel about Qatar, but the fact that certainly the Trump administration still sees them as a valuable component here.
So I think we have to understand that Qatar and Saudi Arabia are two different birds entirely. Saudi Arabia has just as much of an interest as Israel does in preventing the Iranian nuclear march. The Iranians are just as much, if not more, of a threat to Saudi Arabia than they are to Israel. And that has to be understood. Saudi Arabia has a definite interest in its normalization with Israel, in its alliance with President Trump. Obviously, in the previous administration, there was nothing that could ever be done on the Saudi front. The balloon that they launched of, well, there has to be progress on the Palestinian side, was very, very clear filibustering to prevent Joe Biden from ever reaching any agreement. If you remember, Joe Biden, one of the first things that he did when he came into office was to criticize Mohammed bin Salman for his involvement in the Khashoggi incident. And that is something which in an honor-based society, you just don't do if you want to move forward. And so I believe that MBS would never have given Joe Biden any progress on that step. And I think that with President Trump, the music is different, the discussions are different. And I think that on the Saudi front, we will see progress. With Qatar, it's a different story. Qatar is the Muslim Brotherhood. If you remember, also there, just between those two countries, Saudi Arabia blocked the broadcasting of Al Jazeera, the Qatari news agency. So we're seeing different things happening on both of those fronts.
All right, I want to move on to another subject that came in during that press briefing, which is the role of Turkey in Syria. Again, here's President Trump.
The Prime Minister, I said, just, Bibi, if you have a problem with Turkey, I really think I'm going to be able to work it out. You know, I have a very, very good relationship with Turkey and with their leader. And I think we'll be able to work it out. So I hope that's not going to be a problem. I don't think it will be a problem.
Maurice, clearly, I'm sure a big difference of opinion between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump on the leader of Turkey.
Without question. I think we've seen Tayyip Erdogan being very, very hostile to Israel for the last 15 years. Nothing there has changed. He's allowed Turkey to become the home base for many of the senior Hamas operatives. He's given them support all the way along. And having now a Turkish presence in Syria is something that does threaten Israel. It's not another friend that's coming in. It's another foe, just of a different name, with his own grandiose plans for turning himself into the next caliphate and to really expanding and widening and reawakening the Ottoman Empire. And I fear that we're on a different page also there with the Americans. President Trump believing that he has a great friend in Erdogan, and I fear that he will also be looking there at a different point of view from Israel all the way along.
And Nadav, of course, another subject that came up was the issue of tariffs. You're a former Israeli diplomat to the U.S., and I can imagine the challenges there. President Trump making clear that it's not enough for Israel to totally eliminate tariffs. He's concerned about that trade deficit between Israel and the U.S. It's $7.4 billion in Israel's favor. So you would expect a small country like Israel, and a poorer country than the U.S. certainly, to have that kind of trade, there to be a trade deficit. What, if anything, can Israel do to meet that demand? What will be the impact of this, and how much of a challenge is this for Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Well, first of all, I think this whole tariff issue is something that Trump will have to reverse. I'm talking globally, not Israel specific. It's killing the American economy. It's not going to work. Even in the Republican Party, people who understand what it means economically, eventually we will tell Trump, listen, this is not going to work.
Eventually, a lot could
I know. Already
eventually.
the stock market, a lot of money of some of his biggest friends got wasted because of this crazy notion that he maybe understand microeconomy, but not macroeconomy. He thinks he's doing kind of a real estate deal. But with macroeconomy, it will be disastrous for the world economy and for the American economy. In terms of Israel, I think Israel will have to be less based on American aid, because also in terms of the MOU, Obama, signed this MOU.
By the way, President Trump mentioned that, saying it's a lot of money.
Exactly, and you heard it also in his campaign, and J.D. Vance and others were saying we're not for any aid. We could give you a loan, but it all have to be business. So I think Israel have to understand that reliance on American aid, is not forever, and we have to learn how to become an asset to America in a way that will create more joint ventures with the U.S., with the Pentagon, but not just money and do it with it whatever you want.
Right. I should mention Prime Minister Netanyahu has talked about reducing aid from the U.S. 30 seconds, Maurice, anything on that?
I would like to see this as an opportunity for Israel, and for every single one of us. It's an opportunity to reduce the cost of living here in Israel. If we get rid of the taxes on American cars, just for an example,
right,
they could become much cheaper as compared to their alternatives. That is just good for the Israeli pocket in general, and that could then promote. If we get rid of our taxes, they could get rid of their taxes. And so we could really have an opportunity for Israel here. I don't know about the rest of the world. Right. I don't really care about the rest of the world. I'm looking at what is good for Israel long term. And I think that it could actually be an opportunity for us.
Well, let's see if it's an opportunity. But of course, the economy may suffer some blows in the meantime till that is worked out. But that's all the time we have for this particular program. I would like to thank our guests, Nadav and Maurice. Thank you for joining us. Now, of course, for more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at ILTV.tv. Thank you for watching this Insider program. I'm Calev Ben-David, and have a safe and pleasant day. Thanks for joining us.